Welcome, everyone. My name is Carla Jenkins, and I'm partnering with GreyCampus on behalf of this webinar, which is 7 Reasons to Use Project Management for Cybersecurity. And thank you for joining. A little bit about me. I possess over 13 years experience in both the private and public sector. For my main areas are project management, big data, and IT service management. I'm also a certified project management professional, a certified Scrum Master, and an IDO 3 and 4 foundation. So welcome to our webinar about the 7 reasons. So this, at the time of this recording, is December 3rd, 2019. We are in the Christmas season. As you know, cybersecurity is big. Every day you read about a potential data breach, hacking, people selling each other's social security numbers. It's a multi-billion-dollar market. And so I wanted to use this opportunity for this webinar to discuss the 7 reasons to use project management for cybersecurity to protect your data. So in addition to that, I'm also have my own live show, Projectize, which is the work week Monday through Friday, 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And a little bit of the ground rules. Before the webinar begins, everyone will be muted to prevent any noise disturbance. The questions will be taken during the session via chat. So if you're in here, you have the chat feature. You can also email questions to support@GreyCampus. We will be happy to answer. We have somebody in the customer support that's part of this webinar. And we also will have a dedicated question and answer session at the end of this webinar. So without further ado, here's the 7 reasons to use project management for cybersecurity. So first, we start with a definition. What is cybersecurity? It's the protection of interconnected systems such as hardware, software, and data from cyber attacks. So hardware is like your laptop. Software obviously is your updates, and then data from cyber attacks, which are occurring according to cybersecurity tech target. Why is cybersecurity important? Because the world is increasingly online. As you know, with cloud computing, you have the email, internet, the Internet of Things, and connected devices such as Fitbit, Alexa, Cortana, Apple Watch are all part of your day. Furthermore, you have online banking and shopping that has been normalized. People don't think of anything of going online, and you need protection when making the transactions. Yesterday was Cyber Monday, which is a multi-billion-dollar Christmas shopping day. And finally, attackers make billions of dollars trading your personally identifiable information like social security numbers, credit card numbers, debit cards, and mailing addresses. Yes, mailing addresses are identifiable because they can identify which particular individual lives there. Additionally, as of this holiday, NBC News reports the emergence of Grinch bots that on the days leading up to this past weekend, the bots would outnumber humans from 20 to 1, meaning that when you go on like say Postmates or eBay and you bid on something, or something is timed, say with a Black Friday sale from Amazon Prime, and it's timed, it's only good for an hour, the bots will come in, crowd everyone out to get that, and then resell it on the internet for exorbitant prices. Another article, Security Boulevard, reports that the season's digital spending could top $134 billion. All the more reason why cybersecurity is important, and someone needs to protect you and your wallet. What is project management? It involves planning and organization of companies' resources to move to a specific task, event, or towards completion. I mentioned project management because I'm a certified project management professional. You're also on GreyCampus, so if you are interested, they also have project management courses, and if you do decide, certification. What is risk management? Well, project risk management, according to Project Manager, is the process of identifying, analyzing, and then responding to any risk that arises over the life cycle of a project to help the project remain on track and meet its goals. So why is project management important in cybersecurity, and why are we doing this 7 reasons? Because cybersecurity uses a lot of project management principles, especially risk management. As I mentioned, it has a set of principles and a methodology that cybersecurity can adopt and protect its perimeter, its security postures, as well as its customers. Furthermore, risk management is one of those principles that will help cybersecurity defend against attackers. And these 7 reasons are going to be aligned with risk management. So these are the 7 reasons that cybersecurity uses project management. We're going to break down each and every single one of them, and the format is going to be definition, why you should do it, like a tool or technique that gets used for each step, and then a corresponding example, mostly from the Christmas season, on how cybersecurity protects you and your wallet. So the first one is plan risk management. The second is identify risk. The third is perform qualitative risk management. The fourth is perform quantitative risk management analysis. The fifth one is plan risk responses. The sixth is implement risk responses. And the seventh is monitor risk. So once again, the definition for plan risk management, and I'm using the project management body of knowledge, which is a formal guide for project management. It's also what, if you do decide to get PMP, it would be based on. So the definition is, this step discusses the risk management approach for a cybersecurity firm. And this is the most important step, because without a plan, a company cannot thwart attacks. And so some of the tools that get used are data analysis, like computer programming for trends and outliers. You use them. It could be Splunk for data analysis. It can be, I use SAS, anything that can do trend analysis to see, with the outlier analysis, to see if it's just one off or the beginning of a trend that needs a risk response. And when you're doing incident management, or to determine whether or not, you have an incident going into a problem, you need to plan risk management. So your approach is big. Without a plan, if you don't plan, you fail. If you don't fail to plan, you plan to fail. Another tool or technique is stakeholder analysis. So your chief security officer, chief information security officer, and others that are essential to cybersecurity. Risk management plan will be part of that. In addition to that, I would add the CFO, Finance and Budget Office, because planning for cybersecurity against risk, when we go later into this webinar, will be about which risks will be prioritized and allocating money towards the big known risk. Example of cybersecurity risk planning is, High Alert. McAfee, that does internet security, discusses, give an example of old and new Christmas scams that continue to hurt shoppers. Also, risk planning, as I mentioned before, save companies lots of money because they have a plan that they can go to. For these links, in a couple of days, you can receive these slides. So don't fear. If you want to know more about it, you'll have access to them. And these links are current as of this webinar. The second step is identifying risk. And risk identification in this step is you're identifying all of the risks. And right now, it does not matter what size the risk is, if it's a small risk, a medium risk, or big risk. Right here, you're not prioritizing what the risks are. You just want to identify as many risks as you can have. You just want to know what they are. So just the basic steps. Some of the major tools that cybersecurity use for the project management Risk cause analysis, identifying the cause of the problem. This is big for problem management, especially when you're doing tiers when it comes to cybersecurity. Having worked in a help desk, you have different tiers. So you have 3 tiers. You have tier 1, which is the service desk. You just answer questions and that's essentially event management. Tier 2 would be incident management, where enough events happen and there's a trend and you see a pattern, and then you go to tier 2, which is incident management, and tier 3 is where you have your specialists or your problem management. And if you have a significant amount of the same incidents and it's affecting business operations, then that becomes project management. And you have 2 types of project problem management, which is reactive and proactive. So reactive problem management is responding to the incidences that are affecting business operation and finding their underlying cause. Proactive problem management is when you take either the resolution that you have, that the root cause analysis, finding the solution to that to make sure that that problem is completely resolved. So root cause analysis is big in risk identification and is a big part of problem management, because there may be some people who are in cybersecurity or interested in cybersecurity and IT service management, and you see the overlap between the two. A second tool is SWOT analysis, and SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunity, and threats. Cybersecurity will use this technique to evaluate their posture. The goal for SWOT analysis is to maximize your strengths and your opportunities and minimizing your risks, your threats, and your weaknesses. So, a little bit about risk. Risk can be positive or negative. A positive risk is an opportunity and a negative risk is a threat. And then finally, another major tool for risk identification are interviews, especially with other security professionals, on what they've done in previous projects regarding risk. So an example of risk identification for cybersecurity is from Security Intelligence that reports cybersecurity scams spiked the day after Thanksgiving. So as of right now, this recording is December 3rd, 2019. So right now, the scams are spiking because we're fresh off of Cyber Monday, which was yesterday. And it says this is all the more reason to use risk identification to find the attackers and curb or eliminate data breaches. The third step is perform qualitative analysis. So during this step, now you take all of your risk and you prioritize them. So you're prioritizing the big risk over the small and medium-sized risks. Now you're starting to separate them, because the big risks are what we call the known risk. And in the next step, we will move these risks and put a dollar amount to them. But in this step number 3, the big risks would get scored and examined even further, since they have the biggest impact upon cybersecurity. As I mentioned before in the previous example, positive risks are opportunities, negative risks are threats. You can score both positive and negative risks. And I keep harping on that because a lot of people only assess risk with negative as threats, but you do have to score the positive risks or opportunities. Oftentimes, when you go to the next step and you put a dollar amount of opportunity, maybe an opportunity would have enough money that if the probability of a negative risk or threat occurs, you will have the money to come back to mitigate it or even eliminate that negative risk. So that's why I keep reinforcing that positive risk or opportunities. What happens to the small or medium-sized risks? Well, they get put on a watch list. And this is all detailed in the first step, plan risk management. You periodically return to this list to see if any of these small or medium-sized risks become big risks. So you watch them, and periodically can mean weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, but you go back and you want to monitor to see whether or not they stay small or medium, or even if they just disappear. But you just don't want to be blind to these risks because they could escalate and go from small to medium to big risk. So some of the tools for qualitative analysis are risk data quality assessment. Your data quality is very important. You can make data say anything. Having been a programmer and a developer for over 15 years, one of my big things is big data. And it's how you collect the data is important. Removing the bias is important to determine how well the cybersecurity analysts are able to identify and defend against attacks. So you have to make sure that you have a specific type of methodology, which will also be in your risk management plan, to make sure that you don't have a bias when it comes to the data, so that you don't handicap your cybersecurity analysts when they're using the data to do the trend analysis and to spot outliers. Another tool is the risk probability and impact analysis. And this technique helps analysts determine which are the big risks. These risks go for further analysis. So the big risks go for further analysis to the next step. As I mentioned before, the small and medium-sized risks get put on a watch list. And you may ask, why is probability and impact important? Because we will be going into the next step. You want to know what the probability of either a good or a bad risk occurring. You also want to know the impact, be it positive with an opportunity or negative with a threat that happens. That's why this qualitative tool in step 3 is very important. So on to our example, and the World Economic Forum. It may not be cybersecurity, but it's economics and it's about protecting your money. It opines that firms and investors should prioritize cybersecurity risk or lose money. And what I've seen regarding cybersecurity, especially pertaining to the retail sector, is they know it's important. They just don't know how to go about it until there is a breach. So prioritizing the risk will help cybersecurity look at the big picture. And something that's important, that's an economic principle, but gets extended to everywhere else. It's the Pareto principle of the 80-20 rule. And applying it to cybersecurity, 80% of your problems or hacks come from 20% of things that are happening. It's the vital few versus the trivial many. So now we're moving our big risk in step 3 to number 4, which is quantitative analysis. And in this step, you're calculating the benefits of positive risk opportunities versus the cost of negative risk threat. And it's usually a dollar amount attached to it or some type of currency, because now you're getting into the money. And the risk benefit opportunity or the risk cost is you multiply the probability of occurrence times the amount that you can earn or you can lose. Like I mentioned in the previous step with the risk probability and impact analysis, you can use that here as a tool or technique to see how much money you can make from an opportunity and how much a threat will cost you. It's also why earlier on I mentioned getting the CFO involved or the budget, because this is where you're going to need money to cover your known risk and your unknown risk. So that's coming on later in this webinar, but I want to introduce why when it comes to cybersecurity, it's not just the tech people, it's not just the analysts, it's not just the CISSPs or people who do Security Plus. It's actually outside. You need money, you need other people. And finally, you want to know when a risk happens, how much money you would gain or lose, which is why it's all about the numbers, even in cybersecurity. So some of the tools that you will use, there are many. One, expert judgment. You have to get the professionals' insight about how they've scored risk. You also, as I mentioned before, the chief financial officer, budget department, since these are dollar amounts. Oftentimes when it comes to expert judgment, what is the company policy and their appetite to risk? You can be cybersecurity, But if you're in a risk-averse company culture, then your cybersecurity policy will align to that. If you're in risk neutral or you're in the middle, the same. And if you're in risk aggressive, then your cybersecurity would reflect what the risk appetite for your company is. Another time, oftentimes, especially in project management, you have two types of reserves, and it's called reserve analysis. You have the contingency reserves and the management reserves. So the contingency reserves cover the known risk that you've moved from qualitative step 3 to step 4, which is quantitative. And the project manager oversees this. So delving even deeper into project management, this would be part of the cost baseline. There are 3 baselines in project management: the cost baseline, the scope baseline, and the schedule baseline. So since the project manager oversees this reserve, the contingency reserve is in the cost baseline. The next one is the management reserves. Management oversees it. It's not in the baseline. And it covers unknown risks that happened that you haven't scored and you didn't know that popped up. Another tool is simulation like Monte Carlo to see the type of risk behavior, sensitivity analysis, how sensitive is the perimeter of the company to a bad risk attack. That's very important, especially during this time where there will be increased attacks in the retail sector. So you have to make sure that you what are your weak areas and build upon them so you will not be attacked. Another quantitative decision tool is decision tree analysis, which map out the probability and cost. You've seen these before. With decision tree analysis, you would have 30% probability and then $100 cost. So you would allocate $30 to cover the 30% chance that that a threat will cost you $100. And conversely would be the same for an opportunity. If it's a 30% chance that you would make $100, then you also put that with quantitative analysis. So there's a lot of tools here, but when you're dealing with money and the probability of something good or bad happening with risk management, you are going to use this project management, especially in cybersecurity, because data breaches cost money. They also cost goodwill and company reputation. And even though goodwill is on a balance sheet and you don't get that realized until you sell a company, a data breach does bring down the stock price. And that's why in step 4, with quantitative analysis, there's a lot of tools here and some overlap between that in the finance department. So examples, according to Security Scorecard, 90% of retailers are out of compliance with payment card industry data security standards. So that's the standard when you whip out your debit card or your credit card, your charge card, you do any type of payment online, that is the standard. And that's very scary, especially given this time of year when you trust that the company that you order online or in person at a store is protecting your data. Another thing, as I mentioned, the definition of PIC DSS is a set of security standards designed to ensure that all companies that accept, process, or store or transmit credit card information, maintaining the secure environment. And per this year, Verizon's 2019 Security Payment Report, the compliance with PCI DSS has fallen for the second year in a row to just 36.7% globally. So not just the United States, but the entire world. And that's not good, but more importantly, it just magnifies the reason for this webinar, applying not just project management, but making sure that everything is up to standard, especially since there's a standard out there, and during this Christmas buying period, shopping period, you want people to be protected. So now step number 5 is planning the risk responses. You have the big risks, you score them, you see how much your positive risk opportunities will give you money, create money for you. You see how your negative risks or threats will cost you money. Now you're developing strategies. And remember, as I harp on again, for planning risk responses, it's both for positive risk opportunities as well as negative risk threats. So some of the tools for these, once again, the strategies for threats, you must reduce and or eliminate them from occurring. And if you do, then you have positive risk opportunities to offset them or minimize their impact. So some of the strategies for threats are escalate, avoid, transfer, mitigate, and accept. And so when you do escalate, you don't really involve the project manager because they're moving it up the chain to upper management. To avoid the risk, you move your cybersecurity out of the line of fire to just avoid it from happening if you can. You transfer risk through insurance. You mitigate a risk. So if you know what's going to happen, you can mitigate risk through an opportunity, which we'll talk about next. So for instance, as I mentioned, if a threat will cost you $50, but an opportunity would gain you $75, then you pair the two and you would have a net positive of $25. And then accept is acceptance. It's 2 kinds of acceptance. So passive acceptance is to accept it without a reserve, and active acceptance is to apply the contingency reserve to the threat so that you can, when it does happen, that you have money for it. The next tool is strategy for opportunities, and your goal is to increase and maximize these. And it, as I mentioned before, it can be used to offset the impact of threats. So you have the strategies are escalate, exploit, share, enhance, and accept. So obviously with escalate, if you were a project manager or a cyber project manager, you escalate it up to upper management. Exploit is, especially if you're a first mover, the first person, or you have significant dominance or market share, you would exploit the opportunity to get more money. You could share it through partnerships or joint ventures. For instance, you could, like a lot of people over Black Friday weekend, a lot of people pair up or put their services together, and you can buy them together. You can share it with other companies. You can enhance your opportunity by adding to the current opportunity. And then you can also accept, and active acceptance is without contingency reserve, and active is accepting it or using a portion of the contingency reserve of the money from the opportunities to get more opportunity. Another tool is contingency response. You use those for both threats and opportunities. And then, of course, cost-benefit analysis, going back to the CFO and the budget, where you assess the benefit of responding to a particular risk versus the budget. And you may also include the chief financial officer, the chief security officer, the chief information security officer, or budget departments. An example of planning a proper risk response is, per this year, PR Newswire reports that 72% of retailers have been victims of cybersecurity attacks, yet half still do not have a response plan in place, which is not a good thing, especially during the season, and all the more reason for a cybersecurity analyst to be using project management as well as risk management to have a response in case there is a data breach or just to prevent an attack. The 6th step is implementing risk response. Of course, this goes back to planned risk management. When you're implementing the agreed upon risk responses. And so I've mentioned before, upper management, finance department, and other departments may have a say in these risk management plans as well as agreed risk responses. As I mentioned earlier, it could depend on your risk appetite for the company, whether it's adverse, risk neutral, or risk aggressive. Furthermore, this is where I talk about residual risk. Please be on alert for the potential residual risk that may arise due to implementing risk responses. So the tools for this would be expert judgment, because you want to learn and lean on the people who have done this before, like if they've been protecting the perimeter, or if they worked, Black Friday, or they worked in retail, or they've had to deal with a data breach or cybersecurity or preventing an attack. That's someone. These are the people you want to talk to. And then information systems. Everyone has a database, and the goal for this is to track the responses and their outcomes that are essential towards measuring the effectiveness. You can also report performance to stakeholders. Example, once again, Chief Financial Officer, Chief Security Officer, Chief Information Security Officer, Upper Management, etc. An example of the 6-step implement risk responses are: Forbes said per IDC that 70% of all data breaches still originate at endpoints. And the endpoint is a computer, phone, Alexa, Apple Watch, anything that has an end user or customer. And despite the increased IT spending on the threat, breaches still happen. In cybersecurity, you have a thing called hardening of devices. It's a way of making it hard for a cyber attack to happen. But also another thing about users is whether or not retailers and companies are educating their users about cybersecurity, such as just basically when you log on, do you have a PIN on your cell phone or your device? There's a lot of people who don't have PINs, so if they take your phone, then they can just have free access to anything and everything. Versus if you have a PIN, then they won't have access to your data. And having risk responses, what does that mean? Let's use a company, for example. Say you have a department store, and you have an app on your phone. And if somebody takes your phone and you don't have a PIN or a way of hardening or protecting or securing your endpoint device, they can just go on there, use all the information that you have, and just order things in your name. And you won't know until you get the bill or you get a fraud alert. So this example just magnifies why, retailers, especially during this Christmas season and this holiday season, these branches still originate, and the importance of training and making sure that customers are protecting their data. And then the final step, or step 7, is monitoring risk. And this step is monitoring the implement risk responses, going and also periodically going over the watch list. So this is where the watch list pops back up. You want to make sure that the smaller risk, the medium-sized risk, and the residual risk that we discussed in I believe step 5, plan risk responses, to make sure that they don't escalate and they don't become bigger, and that with the risk responses that you've implemented, you derived of in step 5, you implement in step 6, you either mitigate them or eliminate them. And also for monitoring risk, if a smaller, medium-sized risk becomes a big risk, it goes through the same scoring process. So once it becomes a big risk, first is quantitative, then it's risk response, then implementation. Another thing I also want to reinforce is that risk management is just not for certain individuals on your security team. Everyone must be prepared for residual risk. They must identify and they must look for risk, and they must monitor risk. So just because you're an analyst, or you just answer phones at the service desk and you do event management, doesn't mean that risk identification is not your responsibility to. It is your responsibility to monitor risk and to see what may emerge when you implement your risk responses. Some of the tools for monitor risk are data analysis, to see the effectiveness of risk responses. Also, another thing that I mentioned is trend analysis before, to track, to see if the small outliers or medium-sized risks have grown into big risk. The reserve analysis, to review how much money is if left in the contingency reserve and which risk will the money be used to resolve it. That goes back to your company's risk position, if it's adverse, risk neutral, or risk aggressive. Also, it goes back to when you find new risks. As I mentioned in the previous slide, if a small or medium-sized risk or residual risk escalate to a big risk, you're going to score it again. So it's going back to quantitative. That means that you would have to request more money in your budget to cover it, especially if it's a negative risk or a threat. For audits, it's important to periodically see the current risk responses are working, and if new ones are needed due to the emergence of new unknown risk, residual risk, or if small or medium-sized risks have grown into bigger risks. The risk management plan and what you're currently doing in cybersecurity, it's dynamic, it's not static. And static means you just do it one time and set it and forget it. You do cybersecurity every single day, multiple times a day. So the risk at 8 a.m. when you get started may not be the same risk at 5 a.m. when you leave. That's why you have audits to check. And I also mentioned risk responses, because what if the current risk responses that you created in step 5 aren't working when you're monitoring them? What if the big risks get bigger, or you have an additional small risk that become bigger? If you have that type of situation, that does not mean that it's working, so you need to create new ones. And so an example of monitoring risk are the Financial Times reports that retailers brace for cyber attacks during peak shopping season, like right now. And then the paper talked about 3 main cyber attacks: distributed denial of service, phishing emails, and ransomware attacks. So distributed denial of service is when you have multiple computers or multiple people going to a specific website, and you have this thing called synchronize, acknowledge, synchronize, and you're doing the synchronize and acknowledgement, but you're not sending the signal back. So it's tricking the computer of having an expectation of having the 1, 2, 3 pattern being disrupted, and it shuts down the system, and that's how you can overload the system. It's called buffer overflow. That's an example of that. Another thing that people may not be hip to is that, yes, email, commercial emails, we know it was in the mid 90s, around 1994. So it's nearly 25 years old. But most cybersecurity attacks still occur via email. And what happens is you can have, it's called cyber squatting. You can have a website that's close to a name brand or an authentic website. It's missing either a letter or an added letter, and then they send you an email. Or if you don't hover over the email address, it may say something of a name of a legitimate bank. You click on something, you enter your information, they have it, and then they're selling it and using it. So just because email is over 25 years old, it's not text messaging, it's not Facebook messaging, and people may think it's old. And what's the point of email? Email is still the #1 gateway of cybersecurity attacks. Finally, ransomware is where you get your information and they hold it for ransom, and you have to pay money in order to release it. So with that, these are the 7 steps. My name is Carla Jenkins. We're going to do a recap of this, and I'm going to ask our monitor if we have any questions in the chat. So do we have any questions? Okay. So with that, I'll do my recap of the cybersecurity definition is the protection of internet connected systems, including hardware, software, and data from cyber attacks. Project management, which involves planning and organization of a company's resources to move a specific task, event, or duty towards completion. And then why project management is important to cybersecurity is cybersecurity uses a lot of project management principles, especially risk management, to protect people and their wallets and maintain their security posture. And project management has a set of principles and methodology that cybersecurity can adopt to protect its perimeter and customers. Moreover, regarding risk management is one of those principles that will help cybersecurity defend against attackers. And then the steps I told you about, the 7 reasons why you use project management for cybersecurity are: number 1, step 1, plan risk management. Step 2, identify risk management. Step 3, perform qualitative risk analysis. Step 4, perform quantitative risk analysis. Step 5, plan risk responses. Step 6, implement risk responses. And step 7, monitor risks. So thank you for your participation. You will receive a recording and a slide deck when you sign up in 2 days. And for those thinking, where can I see this webinar on demand? A recording of this webinar will be available on the website, on the website's blog, GreyCampus.com/blog, YouTube, and you will also receive an email with that. And with this, I'm going to go to our support person to ask whether or not he has anything.
Hi, Carla.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. So I think we're good there. And,
okay. Sure. And at the bottom, you see GreyCampus and my information where you can contact me. So thanks for the opportunity. I greatly appreciate it. And this concludes this webinar.